This is so basically I went back to really look at his whole book, try and get a sense of who he is, Rabbi Chorin, and what does it mean to be a reformer in 1820? Obviously, everybody in a sense is Orthodox, or if you're a scholar, you come from Orthodoxy. I mean, you really are. There's no movement of reform yet. What there is just a synagogue that's what we would call kind of modern Orthodox. It quickly devolves, obviously, the reform movement, but here he's basically defending it, and he does it, I think fairly well. He says, over and over that he's trying to make things better. That Orthodox services have become, a balagan. They've become kind of a free for all. People that just, everybody's mumbling what they're up to. And he argues that he begins by framing the Jewish people's place in Europe in 1820. And he says, we see ourselves as so insular because we see the non-Jew as other. He says, but actually he tries to argue, and he does this with a lot of, it's not just flippant. He tries to argue that that non-Jews in 1820, Christians in Europe are our brethren. They are, they're like the ger toshav, they're like a stranger who lives among us, and they believe in one God. They keep the 7 mitzvahs of Noah. So you have an obligation to them. You have a sense of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, he says, applies to them. So he has a vision of the Jewish people being part of Europe, not being so separatist. And then he does talk about things that he supported for the Hamburg Temple. And he says why, he says, I'm trying to make things better for the honor of God. And then he does say, I hope that people don't make permitted that which is forbidden, because I have pushed the needle a little bit, but he also says, like, we shouldn't, if things are permitted, we should tell people, because that is a way of retaining the Jewish people, of bringing them close. This was, I think, and then he says that permitting prayer in another language is legitimate because it's like violating Shabbos to save a life. The Talmud says you violate Shabbos to save a life because you're going to violate one Shabbos, you'll keep many Shabboses. So he says, if we don't get people on board with prayer and have them understand what they're saying, it's just going to all fall away, which, may be true. And then even though in Noga HaTzedek, he had argued that coming to shul once a week might be a good thing because it creates a sense of awe and specialness. He does say that he told them, and I think he did say this in Noga HaTzedek, that they should establish 10 people to daven there every day. Because there's a Gemara that says if you have a community of 120 people, you have to sort of, sounds like, pay or support 10 people to make sure that they're there every day. You see that everyday davening was always a challenge, I guess. And then he says, "V'chol davar chadash," he says, there's a situation today. I know that many people who sit al kisei hora, on the throne of hora, which means making legal decisions in Judaism, giving direction halachically. They don't do it the way they should. V'chol davar chadash yimasu mibli bochenota. He says they forbid everything that's new without actually looking at it to see whether it's good or bad. Right? He's obviously talking about the Chassam Sofer here and those who follow him. I don't know how much he's in touch with German Jewry at this point. That would be, I would think he is, but I think by this time, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch is already innovating things. Whether it's schools for girls, although that may have been later, choirs, robes. Hirsch was doing those things, but he says here that the rabbis basically just forbid everything, and I'm the one who's being true to form, And I'm not just forbidding everything that's new, I'm actually examining things. And then I guess he was really taken to task for this. He lists a bunch of things that he has done. Yadati v'eni tam tavin ma shekvar karani. And then he lists a bunch of things that people have gotten down on him for. He says, I spread the psak Torah, the psak din of a great rabbi. I think he means here the Noda Yehuda, Rabbi Cheskel Landau. Behoras heter hadag stiro vati kimuvor. There was some kind of fish, I think it's a sturgeon, that some people are arguing is not kosher, and some people are arguing is kosher. And even though it sounds like Noda Yehuda said it was kosher, other people said it wasn't. It's a little bit like a swordfish issue today also. I think the conservative movement permitted swordfish, and so the Orthodox world doesn't eat swordfish. But the truth is that it has to do with the type of scales it has. And I think there is grounds for both sturgeon and swordfish. And so he had permitted it, and I guess he got a lot of flack for that. Lagal should be talti harash v'hashaorah b'shas kriyas Megillas Esther. This is interesting. He says, I got a lot of flack because I got rid of all of the noise that people make during the reading of the Megillah. So that's very interesting because today it's considered more religious, more, I don't know, to not make noise when they say the name Haman, because you're worried that maybe you'll miss, some of the reading. But it sounds like in 1820 in Orthodox shuls, they liked doing that. Now, I don't know if he got rid of it because he was worried about not hearing the whole Megillah. I would guess that he got rid of it primarily because he's trying to dignify the prayer service. As he said before, the Orthodox services have become a free-for-all, and he wants it to be more dignified and more formal. But actually, it's interesting. It's ironic because getting rid of the noise of after Haman is actually considered quite a religious thing today. Rasho alai, and they also complain against me. I allow the people in my city to make a chuppah, to make a wedding in shul on the bima. You've probably seen that, but that was if you remember in the Psak Din in 1855 in Melechov by the Chassam Sofer and others, one of the things that they forbade besides, a mechitza you could see over and a bima up front, was having a wedding in the shul, a chuppah in the shul. Now, what's wrong with a chuppah in the shul? I mean, nothing's technically wrong with a chuppah in the shul, but it was seen as an imitation of the church wedding. And he says, I allowed that. Now, there's nothing technically wrong with that. And then he says, they are criticizing me for having people say keynote on Tisha B'Av al HaSeder in order. So I'm not sure what he means by al HaSeder. If he means that there's a certain way that they said it, or if he maybe restructured it to be in historical order, chronological order. I'm not exactly sure what he means by that, but it sounds like he restructured the order of the keynote, which there's nothing really wrong with. I mean, these are just poems that recall the destruction of the temple. Many of them are medieval. But, obviously, what he's rubbing up against is this fear of everything new is forbidden from the Torah, that everything's going to be a slippery slope to reform. And we have this today also in the Orthodox community. Actually, there's an interesting article in Tradition not too long ago. It was talking about how during Prohibition, there was a lot of corruption during Prohibition. Actually, Rabbi Silverstone was a little bit involved in something during Prohibition, with an argument with a certain rabbi in New York over this big load of wine coming from Italy that his son had given a hechsher on, and they wanted to sell it. And something happened to Washington, and they were able to sell it, even though the the police in New York had sort of seized this whole warehouse of wine. But so the reform in the 1920s or 1930s during Prohibition had forbade using wine for Kiddush. They said you can only use grape juice for Kiddush because they're trying to avoid the corruption. And so the Orthodox said, you can't use grape juice for Kiddush. You have to use wine. Why? Because the Reform said you have to use grape juice. So, and the way that the Orthodox would write about it was, it's just juice. And so what happened actually was that from this quote, chumrah, from this stricture came a big leniency, which was that Jews started drinking grape juice that was not boiled, grape juice made by non-Jews, even though that's considered wine enough that if a non-Jew touches it, you're not supposed to use it because of the decree of the rabbis that you shouldn't use unboiled wine that was touched by a non-Jew because maybe it was poured as a libation for an idol. But by the Orthodox basically saying grape juice is not wine, so Orthodox Jews started drinking grape juice they just treated it like orange juice. They would just buy any grape juice. And so there was actually this tremendous leniency that came from that stricture. So he says here, that you have to examine each thing. You can't just be strict. I'll call Ela Nesfu. Oh, so he's right. That's the question. What's the response to the reform movement? Is it, this is a good thing, which he's saying, or is it, this is a slippery slope? I'll call Ela Nesatu Alai. Everybody's saying, everybody's so worried. They think that it's like I'm giving up Judaism or something. And God knows that the Jewish people, that I'm being honest about this. That I've always loved the Torah, and that what I do is based on the Rambam, he says, and that what now I am going to have to wage a war against those who chase after me. And then he answers, I think we touched on this, then here he starts to talk about Eli Divrei Brit, that the rabbis in the book by the Hamburg Bezdin took him to task. And that in Noga Hatzedek, he says, I wrote what I wrote. And then he quotes those who were against him. That the rabbi, this is he's quoting now the Hamburg Bezdin's book, that the Rabbi of Ered himself, has gone, way outside the pale. And then he says, this is why I am trying to explain everything. I never came to put a breach in the wall. If anything, I am coming to surround the Torah with roses, as I said. Where does the law come from? We know that even back in the Mishnah, it permitted prayer in any language. And here he sort of re-argues what he argued in Nogat Tzedek against those who have criticized him. Shochein Roma, Lo Sham B'Tzion, Lo Shem B'Tzion, Anti Chodor Marfachim Chadakim Shal Kopan B'Diavad Yatsa. So then he argues about whether you can pray in another language. Can you change the language of a blessing? And he quotes that Gemara that we had mentioned about the shepherd who used to pray, and as long as he used God's name, that was not a problem. It was still considered a proper blessing. Even though over there he was not using God's specific name, he was using Rahmana. So, and then we talked about what if you're using God's name but in another language, do you fulfill is it still considered a bracha? And so he continues to argue what he argues here, that he permitted prayer in another language. So, when you sort of stand back and you say, this is not Reformation like we think about it, like we think this is not the reform movement that we know, right? That's important, I think, to note. That the reform movement at this moment, which is sort of, quasi-orthodox, in many ways, in many ways is orthodox, and does he deserve the criticism that he gets? What was it? What does it mean to be a reformer in that era? Obviously, it's very different than what we know, and I don't know. So far, I don't feel like I've really seen much in his writing. I mean, this is a long book, although actually the Hebrew part's not that long. I don't feel like I've really seen much in his writing that would make me say, he's outside the pale. If anything, because of the Enlightenment, Jews have circled the wagon, the Orthodox Jews are circling the wagons. And, there's this sense that anything new is forbidden. But what he's saying is you can't just blanket say that. You have to look at each thing, and you have to think about the community. If the community wants a chuppah in the shul, maybe you keep them connected by doing a chuppah in the shul. Maybe it's not that big a deal. Maybe if there's grounds for this fish to be kosher, so it's kosher. It's the same struggle that we have today in any era. I think I don't think it's any different. But it's funny. Again, I do wonder what would have happened, had the Orthodox embraced the reform way back in 1820. Would they have kept it as part of the community or not? Because it's not long after this that the reform really becomes much more radical. And then of course by the end of the 19th century, it's a totally different ball of wax. It's a different movement, and it's totally different. But at this time, it's still really within the pale, I think. All right. A little bit more of this. I'll be here next week. After, probably. What? What did you say? Have a good day.
I was just gonna say thank you.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Cool.